I really feel like our democracy is at stake, and there's many reasons for that. Some of them we saw on the screen with the insurrection, some of them because of the revelations about Facebook that creates a world of disinformation instead of, one that we can agree on what the facts are. I really am worried about what's happening at home and around the world.
That was Hillary Clinton there in an interview with ABC News describing the dangers to American democracy. My next guest tonight is the author of a book in which he examines the health of the body politic of America and concludes that it is sick and under attack from within. His new book, Our Own Worst Enemy, charts the rise of a liberal and anti-democratic movement. It warns that the biggest threat to U.S. democracy is not nuclear war or terrorism, but the growing narcissism and nihilism of Americans themselves. I'm happy to welcome tonight to the day Professor Tom Nichols. Professor Nichols, before we even begin talking about this book, I was finishing it today. It's a great read. I'd like to get your reaction to the House subcommittee investigating the January 6th insurrection. Today, Steve Bannon basically told them that he's ignoring a subpoena from the committee and told Congress he's not talking to the committee until former President Trump tells him to. So is this checks and balances and rule of law be damned?
Yeah, this is what happens when one party becomes a cult of personality centered around one person who then can tell his subordinates whether or not to obey the Constitution, the rule of law, the Congress of the United States. This is exactly the kind of corrosion and de-evolution backward from liberal democracy and the rule of law and constitutionalism back toward the rule of personalities and strongmen.
Yeah. And, you touch on that a lot in your book. I want to pull up a quote from your book for our viewers. You write, "The diminishing of threats and the elevation of expectations, coupled with the dullness of daily life in a society gorged on more forms of leisure than it can comprehend, is both the triumph of liberal democracy and the danger to it." I read this and immediately thought of Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. I mean, are we amusing our democracy to death too?
Yeah, and I have to give a shout out to Neil Postman for that concept, because I think he was right, and I think that's what's happening. I think we're also living in something like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where we are just gorging ourselves on leisure and no longer taking seriously our role as citizens. And I think that is a triumph of liberal democracy and of a free market and of a highly effective economy, that we have such a high living standard, that we have so much available to us that we simply take it for granted, and that we forget that citizenship and the maintenance of a functional democracy actually requires effort from every one of us. Mm-hmm. And I think we've somehow lost that simply because we're awash in calories and entertainment and TV channels. Yeah. And we just don't think about it very much anymore.
Yeah, and you talk about in your book, too, the need to, reestablish a sense of civic involvement. That made me think, I went to a public boarding school in North Carolina, and in order to attend, you had to perform a year of community service, basically to give back to the taxpayers who were paying for your education. And I looked up today to see how many programs there are in the United States like that, and I mean, it's incredibly small. So this notion of young people doing something for the greater community, what has happened to that? I mean, most people don't even know what soldiers do now, as an example. What's the remedy?
Well, I think it's telling, for example, that increasingly in high schools and secondary, post-secondary schools, that some form of community service is being mandated. And while that looks like a good idea, the reason it's being mandated is because people aren't doing it on their own anymore. It used to be something that was just part of your life, that it wasn't exceptional that you volunteered in your community, or that you helped your neighbors or gave time to some local charity. Now it's almost like a requirement that you want to write down to indicate that you actually did it, because it's so unusual. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, because the standard of living in the world has become so high, it's possible for us to do a lot of things without having to work together. It's possible for us to, feed a lot of people, or to have high levels of medical technology without us having to actually cooperate and work together. These are all things that can be done as a more singular activity. And so we just get used to the idea that things just happen, but that we don't have to reach out to other human beings to make them happen. In some ways, that's an amazing triumph of an interconnected world where we can all work at our own pace and in our own places. But I think we lose something when we're not spending time around each other.
Well, why not require all young people in the United States to do a year, either to do a military service or to do a year in service in hospitals and nursing homes? Wouldn't that help to create better citizens?
Well, in the book, I suggest a summer of service that's actually military preparation, because I think 6 weeks, 7 weeks of young people living together in a barracks, having to actually, clean up the barracks and get up at the same time every morning would be a good bonding experience and a preparation for public service, to say, that there are things that require you to know how to march in line and to handle a gun and to do all those other things. And then once you're done with that summer, you move on, and your country says, if we ever need you, we can call on you. I'm not in favor of mandating any kind of public service, because it's almost like mandating charity. Once you mandate it, it's not charity anymore.
It's kind of like
there has to be some voluntary aspect to it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit like the COVID-19 vaccine dilemma that the U.S. is in with the mandate issue. Let me ask you, too, about the media. You address that in your book. The media offering us only dopamine-releasing nuggets of news. Doesn't that tie back into Donald Trump? I mean, I saw you on a CNN interview earlier this week talking about the media. And, even CNN, if you watch it from here in Europe, CNN's content is still very heavy on Donald Trump. I would say even more than on President Biden. So isn't the media guilty of keeping citizens high on things that divide them?
Yeah, although I will give something of a pass to the media about Donald Trump, because he's still the greatest threat to the American political system, and he's still talking about running again in 2024, when he would be the prohibitive frontrunner for the Republican nomination. So add to that Trump is always shocking and offensive, and he makes for good television, and it's pretty hard for the media to ignore him, and he makes it hard for the media to ignore him. But I think the bigger problem is that we have gotten used to a 24-hour media cycle where everything has to be immediate and terrifying and instantaneous, and we are all required to have an immediate opinion about it. And I think that's a much more dangerous thing. I think the immediacy of the 24-hour cable news cycle, where everything is breaking news and everything is scary and everything is happening instantaneously, and there's no time to think or reflect. When people ask me how they can break out of this, I tell them to turn their televisions off for a few hours and to spend 30 minutes reading a newspaper. Television news is great. We're sitting here doing that right now. Right. It's an important part of our culture, but not for... I'm paid to have opinions by major journals, and I don't watch 4 hours of cable news a night, and yet millions of Americans remain glued to their televisions for hours at a time because it simply confirms their biases and feeds their tribal loyalties.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I work in TV too. I'm like you. I can't imagine watching 4 hours every day, but a lot of people do. Professor Tom Nichols, it was good talking with you. The book is a great read, and please come back and talk, because these issues I don't think are going to be going away anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.